Welcome to ＳiviLNet. My guest is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. He's an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's party, the Civil Contract Party, won the election with a majority. Prior to the elections, the possible scenarios were that the governing party would win the plurality of the votes, but fall short of securing a single-party majority government, or also the other possibility was a second round between the front-runners of the elections. Nikol Pashinyan won with almost 54% of the votes, thus he will be able to form his own government. Were the final results surprising for you, and why do you think that the support for Pashinyan was underestimated? What were the factors that led to the situation?
I think all of us to some extent were surprised by the results. The general consensus, even though from a lot of the polling that was done, was a plurality. Plurality was a very, very big possibility, but a majority that he attained, and from now what we're seeing is it's going to be a constitutional majority, was not expected. Based on sort of the polling, a lot of discourse that we saw. But at the same time, what we had been able to observe was that most reliable and valid polling that had been done out there showed that a very large portion of Armenian society was undecided. And so we did not know how the undecided vote was going to break. Usually the assumption is it would be split, there would be some leaning, but what we saw was a complete break towards Pashinyan. And that's what catapulted him to the 54th percentile and thus securing a majority. So in that context, that was a little bit of a surprise. He did overperform quite a bit. At the same time, what explains this? The general discourse, and there's no data out there right now at this point, but the general discourse is that this was more of an anti-Kopalyan vote than it was a pro-Pashinyan vote. What we saw was most of what we would call the relatively democratic parties, like for example, Bright Armenia Party, that participated in that did relatively well in 2018. In this election, they struggled immensely. It seemed the Armenian voter engaged in strategic voting, where they basically decided to vote for Pashinyan in order to keep Kopalyan out of power. And so we saw a gravitation of most voters who may have, for example, chosen a different democratic political party, selecting Pashinyan strategically just to keep Kopalyan out of power.
So you were involved in an opinion poll prior to the election by the Armenian Election Study and EVN report. Even that poll didn't project the results like this. Why do you think opinion polls were off?
Well, like I said, the polls weren't precisely off. Our EVN poll showed Civic Contract at 24% and Armenian Alliance at 12%, with about 30 to 40% of the voters that were undecided. And so the undecided vote would basically tell us what happened. So we did have, to an extent, Civic Contract doubling the numbers of the Armenian Alliance. And as the undecided voter heavily broke towards Civic Contract, closer to 80-85 percentile, this is how the results that we got. In that context, the polling did show victory by Civic Contract. It did not show a supermajority. I would agree with that, because there was no way that we could project how the undecideds were going to vote. But our findings did show that the undecideds were leaning towards Pashinyan. In our survey, we did have a question that asked, which candidate do you think would best take Armenia out of the current crisis? And Pashinyan scored 22% and Kopalyan at 16%. So even within that context, we saw a lot of independents considering Pashinyan a better option. So collectively, the polling signified a Civic Contract victory, but the margins were difficult to tell because we had such a large undecided sector of the electorate that was basically telling us we don't know who we're voting for yet.
Right, but Kopalyan's prospects also seem to have been very overestimated. What do you think this is?
Not according to our poll, right? We had him at 12%. So some of the independents or undecideds broke for him, and he ended up being at 21%. That is fairly consistent with the polling, with our polling. We did see some other polls like MPG having sort of, numbers that were not really coherent or consistent with healthy polling numbers that we had seen in the past. IRIs had suggested something similar to what we had, which demonstrated a cap that Kopalyan had. What we had seen for a very long time in polling is that non-democratic forces in Armenia tend to be capped from 15 to 20%. It's very difficult for those that are affiliated with the previous regime to perform over the 20 percentile. And I think this was confirmed in this election. So the underestimation or the overestimation was mostly, punditry and rhetoric. It was not so much based on the data.
We also noticed something from these votes. The majority of the voters who elected Nikol Pashinyan were actually from the Nerses, so from the regions, people who are, we might say, in a less favorable condition, living condition than in the city, Yerevan. What does that say about the voters and how they see the people they elected?
The interesting thing is prior polling had showed that the rural areas tend to be the Prime Minister's base. So civic contract does exceptionally well in the rural areas, and that was reflected in the recent elections. What was very interesting was actually the Prime Minister's overperformance in Syunik. The general assumption was because Syunik had such problematic security development, and since Kopalyan was the security candidate, that he would overperform there. Our poll at the regional level did have Kopalyan winning Syunik. But again, just like the rest of the country, the undecideds heavily broke towards the Prime Minister, thus catapulting his numbers in Syunik. While in the rest of the Nerses or the regions, there was a uniform support for the Prime Minister. So his support among the rural base seems very strong. Polling did demonstrate that the highest alliances support tended to be urban, upper middle class or upper class, and relatively well educated. And so this is why Kopalyan did relatively better in Yerevan. His numbers were actually much better in Yerevan than anywhere else, but they were not enough to match the Prime Minister's. So aside from overperforming the rural areas, he also did really well with the middle class and the lower middle class in the cities and the urban areas. And that's what better explains sort of the disparity in numbers from Pashinyan overperforming and Kopalyan not so much underperforming, but hitting his mark at the 20 percentile.
So does that mean that Nikol Pashinyan remains, even after the war, the figure of the people, and Kopalyan more of an elite? Do they have this kind of representation still in the Armenian population?
That's one way, a very interesting way of looking at it. Because Armenian society has a very small elite, if we could call it that, and because much of this elite has always been traditionally connected to the previous regime, it's better to speak of sort of the more affluent members of the economic elite as being part of the previous system. So in that context, that's expected. Those who represent the authoritarian vestiges are not going to lean towards the current government. So you do have that disparity. But as far as how do we qualify Pashinyan, because he has also started performing very well with the middle class, we can't simply speak of him as being the representative of the rural areas. He does have a healthy support in the urban areas, as we saw with recent developments. So, elite people, because the elite are so marginal in Armenia, that would not be a fair classification. Kopalyan's performance did suggest that there's a very large sector of Armenian society that is willing to basically put aside their support for the revolution in favor of someone who may be a very strong security candidate. So we cannot deny that. Performing at the 21% range, getting close to about 300,000 votes in support is also a very strong performance for someone who has a very negative perception of Armenian society. So those are also, we haven't disaggregated those numbers, but there's something important to look at. Close to 300,000 Armenians voted for a figure who's supposed to be hated. That is something that needs to be looked into. So in that context, we still have to kind of unravel this puzzle of Armenian voter behavior to better understand, what the trends are aside from the macro picture that we've had.
Following the results, the Armenia Alliance, Hayastan Alliance, as you said, led by second president of Armenia, Robert Kocharyan, has declared it does not accept the results of the elections and that they will contest them at the Constitutional Court. Then during a press conference, Kocharyan turned around saying that they will not do anything and they will enter the parliament, though he did not say he will enter the parliament. What can we expect from his alliance in parliament?
Well, I would say that the shift that we saw from Kocharyan could very well be due by the announcement that was made by Russia. The President Putin's spokesperson Peskov did congratulate Pashinyan on his quote-unquote landslide victory, which was a very clear indicator that Moscow accepts the results. In that context, Kocharyan really does not have much to go on at this point in contesting it. So that, to a large extent, ended whatever the Hayastan Alliance could do. They could very well take some components of the results to the Constitutional Court, hypothetically speaking, but that is not going to change the outcome. There's really no evidence, there's nothing widespread to lead to that, and I think they realize that. In that context, I think we're not going to see much of a challenge or an attempt at instability. I do see the Armenian Alliance functioning in two different patterns. One, if Robert Kocharyan does not accept his mandate and does not become a member of parliament, we could expect the alliance to function basically in a fractured way, where you have one party that's basically new, out of Siunik, that has very marginal experience, and the ARF Dashnak, which makes up the big chunk of the alliance, and we don't know to what extent their ideological or policy issues may align without Kocharyan being in the picture. So there's a possibility that the voting behavior of that coalition, that Dashing, may fracture without Kocharyan. The second is that they're very likely going to be an obstructionist opposition as opposed to a constructivist opposition, meaning that I do not expect them to work with the government, but rather to be in consistent opposition to whatever the government brings about. I think that the third place, Baltibunem, I have honor alliance, might be a little more constructive because they immediately accepted the results and have no compunctions in entering parliament. So we might see sort of a very interesting dynamic developing. But as far as the Hayastan Alliance is concerned, pending on how Kocharyan navigates his Dashing in parliament and whether he's there or not is going to be a very important indicator of how this Dashing performs in legislative behavior and in deliberating in parliament.
On June 21st, Pashinyan's party organized a gathering at the Republic Square. In his speech, he said he was calling on the other forces to stop using hateful words to each other and work together for the state building process. So he invited them to work with them in a more serene and healthy environment. He also stated that he would start a stronger anti-corruption fight, and he recalled that we should not make any difference between people from Artsakh and Armenia, which was something that people were waiting to hear from him, as they are both Armenians. So do you see a change in his rhetoric, a hint of a change in the way he will rule the country from now on?
At this point, we don't have enough data points to see if his rhetoric is going to change. Pashinyan, the activist, is very different than Pashinyan, the prime minister, when he's governing. When he has to govern, he does change his rhetoric, but when he becomes an activist, when he's campaigning, it's a whole different rhetoric. He has a very nuanced understanding of his voter base, and he gives his voter base what they want, and it worked really well with this election. But now that the election is over, he cannot engage in the same form of rhetorical discourse that he has done. Whether the magnitude would increase or decrease, obviously we know it's going to decrease, but to what extent is to be seen. I think we're not going to see so much concentration on rhetoric because he has a supermajority now. He has a second mandate, so he's fairly confident. He doesn't have to prove himself in that sense. So we are going to see a more robust attention to policy areas, such as, for example, the fight against corruption. The biggest criticism that he received from his own voter base was that he did not do enough in 3 years to implement institutional reforms, to undertake judicial reforms. And so all that is part of the broader anti-corruption campaign that he had promised, but he had underperformed. So I think we do expect him to really push for those as well. As far as how he's going to perform on that, In his first term, if we can call it that, instead of engaging in reforms, he did engage in rhetoric, right? Instead of having institutional reform, he told his activists to go block courthouses. That is activist rhetorical behavior. That is not institutional governing behavior. My assumption is he has learned from experience, and we're going to see at least attempts for institutional reforms and utilizing institutional mechanisms to develop change as opposed to relying on rhetoric or activist behavior.
And security was one of the topics that are the most heated topic here in Armenia, but he did not touch upon this that much this time. We know that it's his weakness, and that's why we had these snap elections. What do you think he might be doing now to show that he deserves in some way the second chance that Armenian people gave to him?
So the security matter does remain his Achilles heel. That is Pashinyan's weakest point. At the same time, he's always been given the benefit of the doubt by Armenian society, and especially by his electorate. In our polling, we saw that he ranked very low on the competence scale, but very high on the honesty and anti-corruption scale. And I think society, to a large extent, is willing to give him another chance to overlook his limitations by virtue of the fact that they trust him. So he has developed a lot of institutional trust. Whether that could be translated to developing robust security policies, that's to be seen. But there should be no illusions. Armenia's security architecture is going to be heavily reliant on Russia. And so Pashinyan's security infrastructure, or whatever policies that he may have, is going to see a continued integration of Russian presence. Today we are already seeing a discussion of Russian troops being expanded to the region, aside from them having a very strong presence in Syunik. And so as far as the security elements are concerned, do expect Pashinyan to leverage the Russian presence in kind of getting these things advanced. But even if we're going to talk about security policy has to be basically reliant on reforms within the military itself. So unless we fix the problems, you can't really have a healthy security policy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kopalyan, for this talk. Thank you for watching, and continue to follow CivilNet.